Welcome to the 7th episode of the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Grossman. Let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about all things contract value with Josh Queipo. We're going to be first starting with our stat of the week with positional value. Then we're going to be going into some recent news, talking about the current NFL playoff picture and a recent contract extension for Deommodore Lenoir. And then finally, we're going to go into our main topic discussion, which is some awesome research that Josh has done in terms of attaching currency to draft pick values in terms of actually assigning it with respect to contract value. And we're going to get a lot into that. But first, Josh, how you doing? Thank you so much for coming on today. We're really glad to have you.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be on here. When you invited me, I genuinely had a big smile on my face being able to come on a podcast like this attached to an analytics kind of slant. It was really something special. So I appreciate the invite. I'm really excited to be here and kind of talk through all sorts of things through the NFL right now.
Amazing. Can you just maybe before we get started with everything, maybe just go into your background in terms of football reporting, NFL contracts, and all that sorts of stuff that you've been doing for a while now?
Yeah. So I've been reporting on the NFL for about 2.5 years now. So I'm relatively new to the game. Been a lifelong fan. I grew up in Tampa Bay, and so I grew up a Bucs fan. There's a website, and I'm now a part of it, but pewterreport.com, which covers the Bucs and has for 30 years or so. And when I was a teenager, I used to follow them back when they were a hardcover magazine. And then when I moved back to Tampa in 2016, I kind of got back into following them all the way up through 2020, 2021. And it was around that time that it occurred to me, out of all their great coverage, they didn't really have anybody who had a hard understanding of the NFL salary cap and contract rules and dead money and all of that. I'm a self-proclaimed nerd, so I just went and started reading the CBA and eventually got comfortable enough with it that I reached out to their vice president of content at the time, John Ledyard, and said, hey, if you need somebody who kind of has a better understanding of this to kind of hit that niche for your coverage of the Bucs, I'd love to give it a try. And few interviews later, I was on the team. So for about a year and a half, I was exclusively through that. And it was around this time last year that I signed on with A to Z Sports and a kind of a gig role for them to start putting together contract projections for upcoming free agents for the 2024 season. So I did that last year with a partner of mine. We did 105 player projections or contract projections. And then over the summer, we've tried to turn it more from an art into a science, building out some algorithms and things like that to kind of project contracts just by putting in player data. And so that's kind of what led us to here. And then I know later in the podcast, we'll kind of get to our latest project, which we're really excited about.
That's great. Yeah, that's all really awesome. I feel like that's how anyone who's gotten into the football space does it because it was something that they were just we're already super passionate about. I feel it's very rare that I hear I run into someone, they're just like, oh yeah, and then football seemed interesting. Don't get me wrong, as a problem, it is super interesting in all the different respects with which we approach it. But I think at the end of the day, it just it sort of comes back to always a love for the sport. So that's all really great. And yes, we are going to get into all of the really interesting stuff with respect to some of the more harder research you've done into contract value and all of that. Before we get into that, we're going to start with our stat of the week, which is positional value. I'm not sure calling it a statistic is the most accurate phrasing, but I feel like stat of the week at this point has become more of a vessel to talk about something related to the main topic that is interesting rather than actually being purely a statistical explanation. So maybe before we get into this, Josh, can you just sort of give us maybe a basic explanation of maybe just what is positional value in the NFL and why it's something that's talked about so much with respect to team building?
Yeah, I guess it really comes down to how much impact can the best player at a position have on the overall team based on the position they play. I think is kind of the easiest way to break it down. So, and you can see that. I think the best way to see that is how teams spend money, right? So, like the best punter in the NFL makes like $3 to $4 million a year. The best quarterback in the NFL, or at least the highest paid quarterback, I should say, because Pat Mahomes is a bit of a bit of a deal for the Chiefs right now. But if you were to assume the best player is the highest paid player at each position, quarterback, you're talking $55 million a year. So that's kind of the two ends of the spectrum right there, or the two furthest ends of the spectrum, that a quarterback has a lot more impact on whether a team wins or loses than a punter. And you can see that in terms of how much money teams are willing to invest in the best player at each of those positions. And then it kind of follows through as you look at the fifth best player at each position, the 10th best player, so on and so forth. And so you see through these spending trends, what positions do teams really value? And right now, quarterback's in a tier of its own. And then beyond quarterback, you have 3 or 4 positions that are kind of jockeying to see which position do they value next most, right? Which is your 2 main pass rushers, interior defensive line, and edge rusher, and then wide receiver really are the 3 that are kind of behind the quarterback in terms of the most important from a team asset allocation perspective. You also tend to see this quite a bit in the draft in terms of how teams use their first round picks. There are certain positions that are oftentimes taken in the first 5 or first 10 picks. And again, it's those 4 positions largely. Every so often, you'll see another position sneak in there. But that tends to kind of bear out through at least the first half of the first round, that those tend to be an offensive tackle, I think, would be right behind those as well. So you see that. And then as you get further into the first round, that's when kind of guards will start to pop up. You'll see some safeties every so often, linebacker. But with the rare exception, running back doesn't really go in the first round very often these days. And running backs don't get paid nearly as much as a lot of other positions. And some of that goes to the replaceability of the position. How well can you create the same production in the aggregate with less valuable assets in terms of contracts and draft picks?
Yeah, I think that's like certainly like an important aspect of it, because it doesn't entirely come down to the actual importance of the position, right? Like, although running backs don't matter, right? Like that's an important element of this podcast. But no, I will say that like part of the issue with running back pay is less about how important running backs are on the field and more exactly as you're getting at the replaceability of that production. And you might see that a little bit with other positions. I think you could convince me that you see that a little bit with some of the secondary positions or linebacker, but I think that more comes in with those positions. You're really actually more looking at an issue with year-to-year stability, where like there have been studies that'll tell you that secondary play might be more important than like sort of a game-to-game and year-to-year basis in terms of helping a team win games. But the reliability of predicting that performance multiple years out is much lower than if you're talking about, say, an edge player or an interior defensive lineman. And that's when you sort of get into these fun things where contract value isn't just capturing how much value is this guy adding on the field. It's capturing all those sorts of market-based questions that teams have to ask themselves when they're looking at acquiring these players across different positions and how they're building a team.
Yeah, and I love that you brought in their variability versus consistency, because just anecdotally, right, cornerbacks line up right off of receivers. Their job is to erase a receiver. So theoretically, they're just as important as a receiver. But when you look at that year-over-year variability at the wide receiver position, it's much smaller than that at corner. Corner is such a high variance position. You can see that teams are reticent to give out those big contracts, and we're headed to a big cornerback reset in the market. It just started kind of in season, right? With AJ Terrell and Pat Surtain, you've had, and I think we're going to get to Deommodore Lenoir a little bit later. But you're starting to see those contracts push up where they really have had this kind of ceiling to them since around 2020 with Jair Alexander. So, and it's just because, again, even with Alexander, his year-to-year play has had quite a bit of volatility to it, even though he's still considered one of the best corners in the league. So I think that that's a really great point, because GMs are often judged on the results, not the process. And if your results are going to be a guy over a 4-year contract has 2 amazing years and 2 terrible years, he's probably not going to get the most love from, let's say, the public over a contract handed out to a player who's in the aggregate very good. But game to game or year to year, it's so high variance. And I see that a lot in terms of the team that I cover, with the Tampa Bay Bucks, right? So Jamel Dean, fans hate this guy, right? In the aggregate, Jamel Dean's a pretty good corner, but any given game, you're going to get Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. And even across like a full season, you're going to see that from him. And they're ready to run this guy out of town, even though ever since he's been out of the lineup, their defense has looked like a Pop Warner team. So I think that that's a really great point that you brought up in terms of that does play into how teams make their decisions. They want as little volatility as possible, obviously with as much production as possible.
Right. And I wanted to ask, like, in terms of the sort of like when you're doing this work, right? When you're making your contract value models, for example, like the stuff that you're working on this summer, but also kind of just when you were making the sort of more ad hoc projections before, like to what extent are you trying to bake in positional value? And are there circumstances where it becomes more difficult, maybe due to the uniqueness of a player's profile?
I think the positional value is kind of baked in terms of comps. So the market for each position is kind of set. Every so often you'll have a player who kind of pushes the market ahead in terms of creating a new ceiling for the percent of cap in the year, the percent of cap that their average per year salary comes out to in the year that it's signed. And that's kind of the big metric that we look at in trying to find those comps, right? So you can't take a contract from 2020. Let's say we're trying to create a projection for a guy and we find a player from 2020 who signed a contract where like all of the relevant stats are very similar. Well, we can't just take his APY from 2020 and apply it, right? Because the cap that year was $198.4 million. The cap in 2025 kind of pegged it to around $275 million. So just because the salary cap itself has gone up 38% over that time period, you would expect the APY of the contract to have a similar jump. So what we try and do is peg it to the
contract here, where it sort of shows you that exactly on the over the cap page, where they can just, you can sort of look at the contract in context of their historical comparisons, which as the percentage of the cap. I find this page super neat when I'm looking for contract comps.
And it's one that my partner Kyle and we look at all the time, because and this is where a lot of times you'll see like Antoine Winfield Jr., right? Earlier this offseason, he reset the market in terms of defensive backs, in terms of the largest contract by APY in the history of the game at 28.5 or 21.5 million or 21.25 million per year. Right. But if you looked at 21.25 as a percent of the $255.4 million salary cap this year, wasn't actually the biggest contract when you look at it as a percent of the cap at signing. That actually went to Derwin James in 2022. He still held the record for safeties, because the way to think about it is, given this is how much money we have to spend at any given year, the Chargers were willing to give a larger percentage of what they had to spend to Derwin than the Bucks were to Winfield. Winfield just simply got the higher APY by virtue of the salary cap's gone up. So that's where we kind of try and peg those comps, and it's within the position that we are analyzing or that the player that we're creating the comps for is at. So the positional value is baked in because of who we're comparing them to. And then from there, it's just trying to find the most similar players at in terms of relevant statistics to what we found correlate with contracts the most.
That makes sense. That's certainly, I feels like the very legal approach of we find our precedent, we find the case with the most similar facts, and then we use that as a comparison. And it comes as no surprise that the contract negotiation done by lawyers would have a similar methodological approach in terms of the valuation. So yeah. I always appreciated that element of it.
Well, and the interesting thing is this upcoming off season is going to be really, really interesting because you're going to have probably 3 players across 2 different positions who are going to most likely use each other or a recent contract as comps for themselves. And really what it comes down to is who's going to be the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL. That currently is Justin Jefferson, so the wide receiver for the Vikings. But there are 3 guys who are most likely going to be seeking contracts this offseason who are going to try and leapfrog him. One from his position group, which is Jamar Chase, coming off of an amazing game on Sunday Night Football last night. And I think he's the front runner he could win the Triple Crown for receiving this year. He's going to try and make a case to beat Jefferson, and he should, given that the cap's gone up and he's a receiver of a similar caliber. But then you also have Micah Parsons, who will most likely be getting a new deal from the Cowboys. And Myles Garrett's probably going to be looking for a new deal, even though he's still got a couple years left with the Browns. And all of those guys are probably going to be making the play for highest paid non-quarterback. And so it'll be interesting to see Parsons and Garrett actually potentially use Jefferson and Chase as comps to make sure that they're able to hit that number. Because right now, Jefferson's APY is $35 million. Garrett and Parsons don't want to be negotiating off of the 32 and a half million that Nick Bosa currently has at the top of the edge market. They're going to want to try and work off of Jefferson's 35. So it's one of those rare instances where you're actually going to see guys kind of negotiating out of their position for a very specific cause.
Well, I did want to highlight one thing that's interesting. I was just checking the numbers. I think Nick Bosa and TJ Watt, their numbers were like roughly 15% of the cap. Well, the Jefferson number is only like 13.7. So honestly, sticking within their position group, they could honestly probably make a stronger argument than for Jefferson, where Chase is probably confined to saying, I want what Jefferson got as a percentage of the cap, but you have to inflation adjust it, so I'll beat him that way. Whereas I feel like for Garrett and for Bosa, for Garrett and for Parsons, you can really say, no, I want the Bosa number as a percentage of the cap. And that's, 15% of next year's cap is going to be probably over 40, right?
Yeah, it'd be around 41. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, that's, I feel like that's sort of the upper limit of what they could reasonably ask for. Although realistically, it depends on, I don't know, the hardware and how that shakes out. But yeah,
that's part of it. And that's where it gets interesting, because from the team perspective, they're going to try and come off of percent of cap, and teams are reticent to jump markets by several $1 million. That's what made 2024 so interesting, because Penei Sewell jumped the tackle market by over $3 million. The previous high was Laramie Tunsil at $25 million, and Sewell was able to push it up to 28, and then Tristan Wirfs was able to jump him by like a quarter of a step there. But teams typically want to try and keep that jump to just $500,000 or $1 million, so they'll try and create the conversation around APY. The agents will push for the percent of cap, and it's fun to see where that all ends up in the wash. The one good thing for non-quarterbacks to get their market to $40 million is the fact that you do have these 3 superstars who will all most likely be negotiating within the same offseason. And so if the first team's able to successfully tie things to APY off of Jefferson, maybe push to 36 or 36 and a half, that second deal is going to be able to work off of that number to get to 37 and a half, maybe 38. And then the third deal is probably the one where you're going to see that 40 kind of come crumbling down and become the first non-quarterback to hit 40 million a year.
Yeah. It's one of those things where the numbers at the start of the offseason, almost like by the end of the offseason, it's like, well, of course he got that when like that was like even like 6 months earlier, that was like a preposterous number. So I think you're definitely spot on in how that progression kind of happens even throughout an offseason, especially when we kind of saw this at the wide receiver position last year and how they were all playing off of one another and how that number just slowly was ratcheting it up. And we saw the same thing happen at the position in 22. So it's definitely been interesting to sort of watch those things play out. I wanted to ask, do you believe like the current relationship between positional value on the field, contract value, which we sort of noted some of the differences there, and then as you noted how it's tied to draft capital expenditures, do you think these are like efficient relationships, or do you think there's some imbalances that are like, sort of ripe for the taking for NFL teams?
No, I think that there are some imbalances. Not a ton. I think the market overall is fairly efficient, but there are some opportunities to gain arbitrage at certain positions. I think a great one to kind of point out is like guard and center, and you're starting to see those two really converge a little bit more recently, especially with the Creed Humphrey deal. But for a long time, guards were getting somewhere around 25 to 35% additional value when it came to contracts on the free market over centers. Centers was kind of a depressed position group, which is interesting because when you listen to general managers and coaches talk, the pivot is so important. They've got a lot of the line calls and things like that. Anecdotally, in how they talk about the position, it's very important. But then when it came time to actually dole out real money, it had this kind of artificially deflated value. But I think that is quickly becoming more efficient. I think the center market is due for a kick. Tight end's another one where you can replicate a lot of wide receiver value for a lot less money through tight ends. George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta will, in terms of what he's been able to produce on the field, a lot of these tight ends are producing at like a wide receiver 2 level. Wide receiver 2 these days are going for more than $20 million a year. We haven't seen a tight end hit that number yet. So I think you market inefficiencies when it comes to that. Interior defensive line, I think outside of like a couple of guys for a long time, there was a similar inefficiency there. But as with most markets, the smart people do smart things and then everybody else kind of follows, and you're seeing those inefficiencies quickly dry up. Specifically, I think the tight end market this upcoming offseason is going to see a tremendous jump along with corner and center. I think those are 3 positions where you're going to see kind of an inflation to get them into where they should be. And in 5 years, I don't know if there's going to be many inefficiencies from a positional value standpoint.
It's funny because those 3 positions that you noted are the exact 3 I sort of had in my internal notes of like, those are like the 3 that I would sort of highlight. But for like the tight end, for the same reasons, like I think, and you can sort of point to the issues with drafting tight ends in the first round as one of those reasons that it's sort of a wonky market, because none of these guys are like, almost none of these top tier tight ends were drafted with high draft capital. And that sort of creates this weirdness, I think, where, and also the position often takes a little bit to develop in the NFL, save, frankly, these recent trends where we've seen a lot of these young guys come on. So I think that may have just been how it was trending for a little bit and led to this sort of depressed market. But I definitely agree with you that this offseason we could see that ratchet itself up for sure. And that'll be, I think we also know that from like a positional value, it's relatively stable. It actually adds a lot of value, and you can see that from what it does in the pass and the run game, especially one of those guys like who's very multiple and can help you disguise your intent with respect to personnel. So there's definitely a lot of value that elite tight ends can add. And I feel like we've also seen that in a lot of the teams having success just in the modern NFL featuring one of these elite tight ends. Finally, I just wanted to check in, like, what do you think could change going forward? Like, I know, like, not with respect in terms of valuation and more efficient valuation, but more how you see the league developing and how that would respond to some of these positional value trends, or just maybe some takes of your own about what you think is just being undervalued due to some sort of inefficiencies.
Well, I think the most interesting one that I'm keeping an eye on is slot corners. they've been at a depressed value relative to outside corners for as long as slot corners have kind of been on people's radars, say Rondé Barber. And again, cover the Bucks, grew up watching the Bucks, so you're going to see a lot of my references come down to Buccaneers. But Rondé Barber kind of revolutionized that position, similar to Lawrence Taylor in the outside linebacker position. So Barber kind of revolutionized it, and then ever since then, teams have been reticent to invest in nickel corners or slot corners the same way that they do outside corners. But with all of the best wide receivers in the game now moving into the slot, because smart offensive coordinators know this is where I can get them kind of at their most dangerous with inside, outside, releases and leverage, and they can go anywhere and run almost the entire route tree. Against a lot of times against lesser players, it's forced defenses to find better players to play inside. And with that, at a certain point, some of those better players are going to say, you need to pay me like a better player. Right now, the top of the market's right around $11, $12 million. I think Teron Johnson has the highest, from a primary nickel corner in the NFL. And you see outside corners starting to get over $20 million a year. Pat Surtain, again, just kind of reset the market there. So at what point do we see teams make that real investment in a nickel corner in two different ways? So number one, the contract, right? Seeing them get 15, 17, 18, $20 million a year. And then number two, at what point do teams decide we're going to start using first round picks on these guys? Because right now, high second round is kind of where somebody who profiles to be a nickel is going, right? Some guys get taken in the first and end up as a nickel, but it's not the plan of the team at the time. So that would be the one where I think the positional value might change going forward the most, as defenses realize that this position is becoming more and more important to what they're trying to do. The other thing would be the resurgence of the inside linebacker, but only at the most elite level. And I've seen where teams have the thought process, right? When you take guys in the front half of the first round, the Devin Whites, Patrick Queens, the Roquan Smiths, the thought process is this is an elite guy. And if he turns out to be an elite guy, he's going to be worth the investment in terms of draft capital. The problem is that the hit rate on those guys has been so low. And then you have, Fred Warner, who was taken on day 2, just turning into the best linebacker in the league. And there's such a stark drop off from the elite coverage linebackers who really just allow defenses to do so many things they can't do without them, to just a middling level. Right? There's no real middle class of linebacker where you can say, like, it's not a linear drop off, right? There's a
it's very much an S curve in terms of linebacker play.
Yeah. That if they can find a middle class, or if teams can become more efficient in understanding who's going to be a good coverage linebacker, I think you could see a fundamental change in the positional value of inside linebacker.
Yeah, I think those are great points. A couple things that I definitely want to hit on. In terms of the linebacker stuff, I feel like some of our issues come from the instability of the play and the difficulty of with it is to sort of as you say, play linebacker at elite level, because you're doing all these sorts of things or have to be able to do them at a high level. I think part of it also is just our ability to sort of, as you're saying, evaluate, scout, develop these linebackers also just can improve from where we are right now, because it's not one of those positions where I feel like we have the sort of bevy of metrics compared to others that we even approach it with a ton of confidence in saying who is necessarily playing at the most elite of levels sometimes, and that it often requires a heavier touch of film in hand to just help you of break it all down.
I wish it were easier. Out of all of the models that we've built for projecting contracts, linebacker is one of the two that has the most variance in terms of what we think a guy's going to get versus what he gets. So linebacker and corner.
The other be safety?
Corner. Yeah, safety is actually a little bit more stable.
Okay, interesting. But no, that's like definitely what I was going to say there. And then I feel like in terms of the slot corner argument, I think that sort of tracks exactly with some of the other developments that we've been talking about, like interior offensive linemen and interior defensive linemen, in respect to viewing all these sorts of units as units instead of best players in sort of this weak link kind of way, where, you know, your worst corner, you're as best as your worst corner that's on the field. And the same way you're sort of, if you have your best, you're as good as your worst lineman. So it's one of those things where, because of how teams can attack your weaknesses and use those to attack your strengths, frankly, it's allowed, I think it's forced these sort of things where the market has to become more efficient as the coordinators on both sides get smarter about taking advantage of those matchups.
Yep, couldn't agree more.
Great. I think this is a good time for us to pivot into some of the recent news and talk about the current NFL playoff picture. So I just want to pull up a graphic that I have here of the current sort of breakdown of who's in the NFL playoffs and what the current, probabilities are for everyone. So let me just pull that up 1 second. All right, yeah. So we were able to get up the NFL playoff probabilities in the AFC first. We could just talk about. There's definitely a lot of, I would say, variability here for that 7th spot, while the first 6 teams look pretty good. But you could also convince me that Denver just is actually a pretty decent team and might run away with this 7th spot here. I don't know. What are your thoughts on sort of the drama in the AFC?
Yeah, I think the thing is there's not much drama. Like, I think that this is pretty set with the first 6. And I do think Denver has turned into a pretty good team. I think Bo Nix's ascension, or how quickly he's been able to kind of level out his play into that of a solid starting quarterback paired with what turned out to be a very good defense with Vance Joseph as the defensive coordinator there, has turned Denver into kind of a real, I don't want to necessarily say a powerhouse, but they're not an easy out for anybody. I think most teams or most fan bases at the beginning of the season if they saw Denver on their schedule, they were penciling that in as a W. And I don't think anybody for the rest of this year is going to do that. I think the wild card there is probably Indy, just because the AFC South is still kind of up for grabs. They're only a game back in the win column, 2 in the loss column from Houston, and Houston hasn't looked as good as everyone thought that they did. And Anthony Richardson's such a wild card in and of himself that I think that gives Indy kind of this puncher's chance of making the playoffs, either as the AFC South division champ or potentially as the 7th seed. Outside of that, I mean, everybody else is kind of just already fallen off. Miami went too many games without Tua. Cincinnati, that one's really interesting because I had it here. Let me see if I can find it. Their Pythagorean, I track Pythagorean, win percentage. I think that it's kind of a really good way to understand the coaching aspect to this. And, their point differential is actually positive. Now it's positive by 1, right? But they're basically they should be a 500 team. But they're 3 games below 500 just because they haven't been able to pull out like these wins, like just last night against the Chargers, losing in the last moments there. So I think Cincinnati's a lot better than their record, and I think they're going to be a hard out for a lot of teams towards the end of the year, and they could play spoiler to help somebody like Indianapolis potentially sneak in week 18. But the rest of the AFC, I'd say, I don't see anybody with a path to surprising down the stretch and making it into the playoffs. Interestingly enough, the Jets have the highest.
I left them in the graphic so that you would have to talk about them. That was very intentional.
To talk about them, right? So yeah, so the Jets I think are a much better team than their record, just in terms of the talent on the field. Their difference between their actual win percentage and their Pythagorean win percentage is the highest difference in that direction in the NFL. It's 0.142. So, they should have 4.6 wins. Obviously, you can't have a partial part of a win. So they're really more of a 5.
We'll take partial wins at this point. I mean, honestly,
I'm sure they would, but they're really like a 5-6 team versus a 3-8 team. But at this point, they've banked so many losses, they'd have to win out to go 9-8. And in the AFC, I don't think that makes the playoffs versus all these other teams that are already closing in on 9 wins. So it's an interesting team. I think they're going to blow it up in the off season. It's been must-see TV to watch this year. I feel bad for Salah, but yeah, I think the AFC is kind of set. I think a lot of the drama comes from the NFC, right? Where it's still so wide open. There's 12 teams, I think, who still have a pretty viable path to the playoffs, and that's what I think most of your drama in these last 7 weeks is going to come from.
Yeah, to the extent it's and it's 12 teams, and then you can't even include the Bears, who, without some of the worst luck I've seen, would be right in it right now.
Yeah, so it's a curse.
It's been much more competitive.
A blocked field goal and a highly improbable Hail Mary away from being 6-4. I mean, it's ridiculous what's happened to that franchise.
Yeah, I can't help but laugh, but I can't imagine that's how the Bears fans are feeling right now or in that locker room. I feel like I definitely wanted to get your perspective on what you thought about the NFC South. Atlanta looks pretty weak. The Tampa Bay schedule all of a sudden opened up in terms of who they're playing. It feels like these next 3 weeks could be just a chance to sort of stack wins and take the division especially if Evans is back this week and the defense can just just tread water while the offense does its job.
Yeah, that'll be the interesting thing. The Bucs are set to get Jamel Dean back, which should help with one of their 2 major problems on defense. But yeah, it's been interesting. If you look at the Bucs wins, they have some pretty good wins on their record. They don't have a lot of wins, but they beat Philly, they beat Washington, they beat Detroit, right? So that's 3 of their 4 wins, and then they have New Orleans, right? The Falcons don't really have any high-quality wins unless you consider Tampa Bay a high-quality win, right? And I was looking this up for somebody who we do a Bucs podcast every week, John Ledyard, who actually brought me on at Pewter Report a few years ago. The Falcons' EPA per play against the Bucs this year in 2 meetings is 0.22. Their EPA per play against the rest of the NFL is 0. That is a ridiculous spread, right? So, against the Bucs, they're the greatest show on turf, and then everyone else, they're an average offense and a bad defense. So, but now the Falcons are going to have to play some pretty good teams down the stretch. The Chargers, the Commanders, who have turned out to be a good team, a couple others I can't remember off the top of my head, and the Bucs only have one good team that they have to face, right? So it's the Chargers. Outside of the Chargers, they've got, I want to say, a meeting with the Saints, 2 against Carolina. They've got Dallas, who's turning out to be not a good team. So they do have this opportunity to kind of go 6-1 down the stretch. And if Atlanta falters like they did just this past Sunday against Denver, I would say the South is still open. I don't think anybody's penciling Atlanta in. Now, the one thing Atlanta does have is they have the tiebreaker, the head-to-head tiebreaker, because they beat the Bucs twice, right? So the Bucs basically have to clear them by a game. Any ties are going to go to Atlanta. I think the other good thing for the Bucs and for Atlanta really is the fact that all the other teams that are kind of in there with them for the 5, 6, 7 seeds, for the most part, are coming out of the NFC West and are going to beat each other up and create some parity in terms of those schedules. So it gives both teams a chance to kind of vault the Rams, the 49ers, and the Seahawks, because those teams are going to kind of cannibalize each other.
Well, this is actually one point I wanted to make here is when you look at who the top 5 teams are, it's whoa, okay, there's 3 NFC North teams and 2 NFC East teams, and you realize, well, that's the wild card right there. You look at the Atlanta probability for the playoffs. They have a 71% probability, but that's all just the division pretty much. And Tampa Bay's got a little bit more likely. There's a few more worlds where Tampa Bay makes it in addition to Atlanta, but it's still, as you're saying, not it's still that would be the sort of world where that happens, the sort of version you highlighted, but it's very much same thing with the NFC West. These teams are sort of fighting for their divisions, and that's kind of all that's really left in play in the NFC because of how strong the NFC North and NFC East are with those top 5 teams right there. So when you look at the 2 spots that are up for grabs, it's really those 3 and 4 seeds, actually.
Yeah, and that's a great point. But again, there's going to be, and I think this is where it's really great in terms of the NFL schedule making, is a lot of divisional games come late in the year. And because of that, you're going to see some of those NFC North teams kind of knock each other down. I think it gives some opportunity for these teams that are fighting for the 7th seed to potentially sneak into the 6th seed. If you have like the Vikings turn into a pumpkin at the end of the year, or Jordan Love's turnover issues, spell some disaster for Green Bay down the stretch. So
or Cliff's offense pulls down. We've certainly seen that before. Or Cliff Kingsbury's offense cools down. Like that's also certainly we've seen, and that's definitely like none of these teams are set in stone of that top 5, and that's absolutely fair to point out. I was just sort of noticing like the slight differences in the division odds versus playoff odds overall. But you're absolutely right to point that out. There's some fragility for sure at the top.
Absolutely, and that's where like I said, that's where I think a lot of the drama for the end of the season is mostly going to play out in the NFC. I think you're probably going to see a lot of NFC games getting flexed into some of those primetime games, because that's where I think the NFL is going to hit most of their ratings in terms of who's going to make it in, who's going to make it out.
That makes sense. So I think now would be a good time to pivot into the Lenoir contract. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. This happened, I think it was last week. And we've been sort of talking about the sort of slot market and the corner market in general, and what an interesting intersection of the two. And Lenoir, who has been playing a bit more slot this year, has played outside before and looks to based on the contract, be moving outside again at some point. Maybe, I don't know. It's an interesting contract. What were your sort of thoughts when you saw this one?
Yeah. So when I first heard about it, to be honest, I was shocked. Like, I did not see, and the original APY that was announced, I want to say is like 18.2, if I remember correctly, or $18.4 million per year. That took me by surprise. And even what it turned out to be, which you're showing on the screen here, basically $18 million a year, it's still extremely inflated from what I thought a potential contract for him would be. Our projections had him around 14 million, to be completely honest.
Was that as a slot or an outside, or was it sort of
our projections? To be completely honest, our projections look at corner as a single position. We haven't actually split out slot. Interestingly enough, the slots, we tend to do fairly well on identifying slot contracts overall. So that is for next season. We're hoping to pull that one out and have it as its own. And we're also going to look at nose tackle as well, because that one throws our projections off quite a bit. But just as a corner. And so I was genuinely shocked. It became more clear to me once the details came out in terms of the guaranteed money. And this is where the APY is shiny, right? So I think he slots in top 5 at his position in APY. Let me double check that.
I think here's the cornerback market. I think he's number 12. He's number 12 at an APY.
So a little bit further down. So still, it looks really good because it's up near that $20 million that a lot of players have kind of been flirting with for a while now. But when you look at the guarantees that he got on this, they're so small. And you can kind of see it just on this page, right? Like, let's say San Francisco decided to cut him tomorrow. It's only $16 million in dead money, right? 15 and a half, actually. And that's because they really only guaranteed him, practical guarantees are about $21.5 million through the end of 2025. So he basically got a 1.5 year guaranteed extension for $21.5 million. Well, that comes out to about $14.3 million per year on the APY, which made a lot more sense from the projections we had, right? From there, San Francisco effectively has 4 1-year options that they get to execute the same year. It's not even a rolling guarantee structure where they've got to make a decision on 2026 in 2025. Nope. They can wait till the end of 2025. And we already talked about how volatile the cornerback market is. If he has a down year in 2025, San Francisco can come back and say, you know what? We can basically cut you for no dead money or for very little dead money, or we can renegotiate this and bring your APY down, right? So it doesn't give him a lot of security beyond 2025. Doesn't give him a lot of security in terms of just his overall guarantee structure. I'm not a huge fan of this contract from the player side. And again, he gave up 5 years, which is a John Lynch staple. Like in San Francisco, he holds everybody's feet to the fire for a 5-year. And then they seem shocked every time a guy comes back to the negotiating table with 2 to 3 years left on his deal. Like, I'm undervalued, give me more money. And they're like, what? You have a contract. So not a fan of this from the player side. I don't honestly understand why Lenoir would have gone for this. I think he definitely could have gotten a lot more in the guarantees, maybe given up a little bit in terms of the APY overall, but potentially also could have gotten to free agency a year earlier than he is right now. So, but once I saw the guaranteed money, it made me feel a little bit better about our projections. And again, full disclosure, cornerback's one of the hardest ones to peg down because different teams value different things. So it makes it hard to find high correlating factors. But just in general, not a huge fan of this from the player side. And San Francisco did really well on this one.
Yeah, I feel like looking at the cash flows here kind of tells the story. Once you realize their guarantees run out, and a lot of them are even being applied to per game roster workout bonuses, which is okay, that's a guarantee for release, and that's it. But it's not really a guarantee in the way we think about it conventionally, because if you're not healthy that day or you don't come work out, you don't get the money. So it's not quite guaranteed in the sense of the word guaranteed. And yeah, I feel like the cash flow here just does a nice way of showing that. I wonder if this is one of those things where it's if I just showed you the April 1st vesting dates, the 5-year structure, if you could have just gone picked that and oh, I know what team this is.
Yeah, it would have quickly become apparent, especially at the 5 years that. Like I said, that's a John Lynch staple. He did it with Trent Williams. He did it with Boza. He tried to do it with both Debo and with Brandon Ayuk. And fortunately, the wide receiver market made it a lot easier for them to push back on that. So, but yeah, it's kind of a staple of John Lynch. He wants to get you in for the long haul, but then have the guarantees run out after about 2 years and just leave you there with no guaranteed money, kind of waving in the wind.
I mean, yeah. And when you think about everything as a percentage of cap, though, you start to think about you're getting these low options in the future when you expect the cap to rise. And you also just get the player at a pretty reasonable rate for the first, 3 years before you ever get there. So yep. I think if you think about it, the 3-year deal is just sort of exactly what you would have pointed to. And then, as you said, it's just these free options at maybe what's a high number, but when you think about the cash versus what the cornerback market is probably going to look like in 3-4 years. And that might be a really, really nice deal, even for a corner who will be entering, sort of the back half of his 20s.
Yeah, especially the cornerback market has no choice but to move up because of the way that the 5th-year option, or I'm sorry, the franchise tag works. Is a lot of these guys their 2- and 3-year tag APYs, if teams wanted to just try and tag them over and over, is going to be larger than some of the highest deals in the game right now. So the cornerback market is about to explode early with Patrick Surtain. And then this deal, it was smart for San Francisco to get out in front because the APY on this is not going to look that egregious in 12 months. And in 24 months, it's going to look like a downright steal. And that's where I'm worried because in 24 months, all the guaranteed money is run out for Lenoir and his APY is going to look really soft and he's going to have 3 years left on his deal. It just, like I said, I really wish he would have gotten more guarantees, even if it meant a lower APY on a shorter deal even.
No, I agree with that. I think that deal is super interesting and sort of like a nice. We've had sort of the larger deals, but it's a very interesting deal, I think, when we think about some of the conversations we've been having today about positional value, even within positions, about the timing of when you lock players up with respect to the salary cap and all of that. I think now is a good time for us to jump into our main topic conversation and talk about some of the amazing research that you've done. So, yeah, this is gonna be fun because I encourage anyone who's listening now that you might get more out of it if you actually just pause the podcast here, open the article that we'll have retweeted that will be part of whatever thread you probably found this podcast on. But if not, please you can find it at joshqueipo.substack.com. And I think you can find it through his Twitter, through my Twitter. You'll be able to find it and just give it a listen, give it a read, because it's really interesting, and I think you'll just get a little bit more out of this conversation if you've had the chance to read through it first. But yeah, Josh, why don't you just sort of before we even get into what you did here, just like what was the problem that you sort of saw? And you said, "Oh, I want to solve this."
Yeah. So it really came down to like on draft day, you'll see players traded for draft picks, right? Or especially around the trade deadline, you see a lot of players traded for draft picks. And I don't know about you, but I can't tell you how many times a trade happens where it's player for picks and fans are like, wait, what? Like, this guy went for just that? How is that possible? Like, what in the world was my team thinking giving up this premier player for that little draft capital? And you hear a lot of people in the NFL consistently say it. I say it myself, right? Like, you got to look at the contract, right? Is it an expiring contract, or are there multiple years left on it? And is it underwater to a certain extent in terms of, is the player playing up to the cash that's attached to the contract that's still owed? Because the draft pick that the team is receiving comes with a hard cap on how much they're going to have to spend on that player, because there's a draft slotting system, and they're getting a player for 4 years, right? So you get 4 years worth of value out of whoever you select, or you have the option to, versus the player you're giving up. You know, a lot of times these are guys with just 1 year left on their contract or less. But even with that said, it's still two different currencies, right? Like, I think most people who are watching this podcast probably understand that, you know, there are a lot of draft pick value charts out there, right? I think the two most popular or most cited are the Jimmy Johnson chart from the Dallas Cowboys in the early 90s, which teams still use. Like, it's proven that is the chart that teams use, even though that's a very inefficient market. And then the one that I think has been much more popularized over the last 5 years, which does a much better job of properly valuing the picks based off of an empirical process, is the Spielberger-Fitzgerald chart, developed by Brad Spielberger, formerly of Pro Football Focus, and Jason Fitzgerald of Over the Cap. So, but the thing is, the Jimmy Johnson chart was done in points, and then Spielberger and Fitzgerald fit their chart to the Jimmy Johnson chart in terms of giving the same value to the first overall pick, to show a relationship between the two, to more easily show the difference between what they see as the value of picks versus the original Jimmy Johnson chart. But basically all draft picks are valued in points. That's the currency that's used. Players don't come with a point value attached to them. They come with their on-field production, which can be quantified in terms of how much would they most likely get if they were a free agent right now. And then the contract attached to them, how much money is due to them by an acquiring team. Those are two different currencies, and somehow teams for decades have been finding a way to bridge the two, but there's been no real public process or publicly available way of bridging the gap. And so that was really the problem that I was trying to solve, is say, okay, how do we create a single currency that can help us better understand why this player is only worth this much in draft capital, or that player is worth a lot of draft capital. And I think if I had published 3 weeks earlier, the whole would Myles Garrett go for 3 first-rounders, Jahmyr Gibbs, and a second-rounder would have been a lot easier to say, no, that's way too much for Myles Garrett.
No, I forgot about that story. There, I mean, it is one of those things where it's like where you get to the idea of like how do you like it's very hard to find. Like theoretically, it's an efficient market, right? But like there might not actually be a price at which they would trade Myles Garrett, and like there was also a team that's willing to pay that price, right? Like that just might not actually line up in anyone's sort of internal utility curves on these things. But no, it isn't. It is a super interesting question, sort of at like. So I guess like, how would you say that your process in the main way I guess differs from the previous draft curves is of course the contract value versus the use of points. Would you say there's anything else about the methodology that was different? Like, was there anything different with respect to like your basis for determining performance value for anything sort of like that?
Yeah. So I think the two major differences you outlined one of them there in terms of ultimately I was getting to a different currency with which to measure. But the other, so I based most of the way that I valued the draft picks, and I want to be very transparent on this, on the same process that Fitzgerald and Spielberger did in their book, The Drafting Stage, because I did find that to be an extremely accurate and useful way of determining value. And just to kind of give a real Cliff's Notes value idea to it, what they basically looked at was the second contracts that players signed after they were drafted, after their rookie deals were up, and compared that contract on an APY basis to the average of the top 5 APYs of their position group. So to determine at each draft position what would be the expected value of the second contract based on the position that the player played. So that I mimicked that process for most of what I was doing. Where there was some variation is what Fitzgerald and Spielberger looked at was just how much was the player making in their 5th year in the league. So most rookie contracts are all for 4 years, right? Or for drafted players at least. So most players are getting their second deal in their 5th year. That's not always the case. Some guys do get early contracts after their 3rd year, but they use the APY off of that deal, which makes sense because it's covering their 5th year in the league. But there are also first rounders who can get a 5th year on their rookie deal exercised by the team. And it's for a set amount of money based off of the position that they play and the average of certain players at that position. It also uses an antiquated positional slotting system. So you almost never see 5th year options for offensive guards or centers because it's applying offensive linemen, which includes tackles, which has a much higher positional value when you actually get to a free market. So what we did was we ignored the 5th year options if there was one exercised on a player, and we went to the next year where they actually got some type of close to free market deal. Now that still could be they had a franchise tag placed on them, but the franchise tag is at a much higher value and it pushes them up into one of the highest paid players at their position. So there was a small difference in process from what Brad and Jason did there. But those were really only major differences. Outside of that, we tried to mimic their process. Their process wasn't fully transparent in the drafting stage, so we tried to mimic it as best as possible. So I think it's probably best for me to outline what our process was. Because there is such a small sample size, Brad and Jason only had 5 drafts that they could look at, 2011 to 2015, covering the time period from the 2011 CBA where the draft slotting system started on rookie deals. We expanded that from 2011 to 2019. So we had a larger draft pool, but it's still a small sample size. You know, if you're only looking at the first overall pick, that's only 9 contracts. There's a lot of variance there. So in order to create a larger sample size, what we did is for any pick in the draft, we were looking not only at the contracts of the players selected at that pick, but also the 3 picks prior and the 3 picks after to create 7 data points kind of wrapped into that pick. Obviously, you can't do that at the end. So, the first overall pick, we looked at 1 through 4. The second, we looked at, I think it was like 2 through 5 until we could get to that kind of 3 up, 3 down process. And then on the back end, obviously, kind of doing it the same way in reverse. So that was our process for getting there. And then again, the difference is figuring out a way to turn that into what does this mean in salary cap dollars? And that was kind of where we hope to move the conversation forward from the amazing work that Brad and Jason did.
And yeah, at least for me, that makes a ton of sense, because as you sort of mentioned, contract value is the sort of universal unit here when we're thinking about, what's actually going on. It's when you think about team building, it's often, it's just pure cost benefit in a lot of ways. And that is just tying everything to the same unit. That is your fundamental unit of spending money, does make a whole lot of conventional sense. What was your process for determining sort of the exact contract values for each pick? If you want to walk through it in a little bit more detail of how you got to the numbers that you did on that sort of draft curve that shows up towards the end of your piece.
Yeah, so the initial process in mimicking Brad and Jason was to kind of determine the expected contract in terms of APY as a percentage of the top 5 players at that position in terms of the most expensive contracts at each position. From there, how do we get to dollars? We decided to take a look at the draft in a bucketing system. And what we mean by that is the top 5 overall picks, then picks 6 through 10, then picks 11 through 16, then the back half of the first round, which is 17 through 30. I'm sorry. 17 through 32, then top 50 or 33 through 50, top 75, top 100, and then from there trying to peg it to each round. And what we looked at was what is the probability of each position being selected within those buckets. From there, we can take the probability of that position being selected and apply the expected contract in terms of the percent of the top 5 at that position and basically multiply that probability by what's the top 5, the average of the top 5 contracts at each position times what we expect that pick to get as a percentage of those. So in doing that, we get a composite APY based off of all of those probabilities. What this really allows teams to do is to understand in the aggregate, what is the value of each pick? But then for teams, how it can be applied is if a team wants to trade up for a particular draft pick, knowing the player that they're going to take and the position that that player plays, then they have a better idea of understanding the expected value of the pick based on that position that player plays. So what it can do is it can better highlight the reasoning why teams pay premiums to move up and justify it based off of the position of the player that they want to select. And for teams trading down who don't know what player they might select when trading down, they can still use that composite and have an idea in terms of dollars, what is the value of that draft pick? And then when you start looking at player for picks trades, the A.J. Brown trade from Tennessee to Philadelphia a few years ago helps to better illustrate that value when you're bridging the gap from players and picks.
That's all fascinating. I'm going to pull up just a little bit, and maybe this is a little too zoomed out, but I just wanted to pull up the curve a little bit and just want to clarify something. Am I looking at, I think I zoomed out even more. Am I looking at surplus value or total value?
This is total value, and this also represents what that pick will present over the first 4 years of that rookie deal. That's the other thing as part of our process. I couldn't figure out the best way to incorporate the value of a 5th-year option for the first round of picks. So that's still not incorporated in this. but this is looking at the composite value based on the probability of each position being selected at these or within these buckets over the course of those 4 years. So first overall pick, easiest one to kind of pick out, worth $110 million. Well, that means that and that's in today's cap dollars, 2024 cap dollars. We would expect that player to sign a contract for about $25 million per year if they were signing a contract in 2024. So, or I'm sorry, 27.5 million. I apologize. So, and then with each subsequent one, again, kind of divide by 4. It gives you an idea of the value of that pick in terms of an APY, or average per year.
Right, and then you take that over the actual contract paid, and that's how you get to this sort of surplus value number for each pick. If you wanted to translate it sort of back into the straight up surplus value terms,
right?
But no, that's awesome. That's awesome. Like, I guess the AJ Brown trade's a good example, but are there any other trades that have happened either recently or in the past couple of years? Whatever, pick whatever you want that sort of you feel like are nice illustrations of sort of the usefulness of this curve, especially in these sorts of trade value conversations.
I thought I would do one from this trade deadline. So Davante Adams, I thought was probably a good one. Vegas sending him to the Jets for a conditional 2025 third round pick. So a lot of this depends on obviously the valuation of the player, right? So some of this that you're going to hear from me is based on our projection. Davante Adams is still one of the best receivers in the NFL, but he is over 30 years old at this point, and that does have a hindrance on somebody's value. We had him pegged at a little over $22.5 million per year in terms of.
Oh, look at that! I kind of just took a shot. I was like, I wonder where it's going to be. Took an ad hoc guess. We ended up, yeah.
Now keep in mind that is over a full year's worth of production, but the Jets were trading for Adams, and the understanding most likely is while he has several years left on his deal, they're at very inflated cash flows, which are not guaranteed. So given that, I'm treating this trade as if the Jets are basically trading for him as a rental for just the rest of this year. And when
I think that's fair. I think those are fake years. I think that's entirely reasonable.
And there's a good chance that the Jets will continue to employ Adams after this year deal, and you can't really incorporate that into the trade value because it's a separate transaction. So with the Jets trading for him, they still had 11 opportunities to use him, right? They had 11 games left in the season at the time. So if you take that, 22.75 million divided out by 17 and multiply it by 11 games that they could use him, that's $14.65 million in on-field value. They weren't going to have to pay him $14.65 million. They actually got a little bit of a surplus value in terms of the salary owed. And I think they owed him like $11.6 million, which meant that they were getting a little over $3 million in surplus value on the contract. So the overall value they were trading for with Adams was worth $17.7 million. Giving up their third round pick at the time, we had it valued at a little over $27.4 million. I'm trying to remember I can't remember the pick number. If you want to scroll up, you can probably see which pick that accounted for, or within that chart. Sorry, go ahead. So it was a third rounder, so it would have been less than 96. So I think if you go to page,
what was the number you said?
It was a third rounder, so it would have been less than 96, and it would have been about 27 million. So at the time, I think the Jets were picking in the late 70s, based on where their record was.
Sorry, I think that's going to be roughly here. So there's definitely
around pick 70 or whatnot. Now that has changed since with them continuing to lose, but we work off the information we have at the time of the trade. So the pick that they were slotted for at that time was worth about $27.4 million. So Vegas made out well in this trade because they were giving up $17.7 million worth of value and collecting $27.4 million worth of value for that third round pick that they were getting at the time. That's only probably increased because the Jets continue to have a higher pick in the third round now that Vegas is taking over. So the surplus value that Vegas collected on that trade is equivalent to about $9.7 million, which is like picking up a free pick valued at pick 176 in the draft. So Vegas did really well in that particular trade. What I've noticed in going through a lot of these trade deadline deals, and again, a lot of this is based off of our player valuation. So for those who are following along, if you think that we're wildly off in how much we valued Davante Adams at, well, that'll change the calculus for you. But based on what we've had, most trades, and it's interesting, like the NFL is a fairly efficient market when it comes to this. Now, there are outliers like this one. Carolina sending Deontay Johnson to Baltimore for a bag of potato chips. That would be another one that seemed to be
they've also used him like he's less valuable than a bag of potato chips.
That is true. So maybe they knew what they were doing at that point, right? So, and a personal hero of mine kind of works for Carolina. I'm sure he was a part of that conversation, Eric Eager. So, but in general, like looking at the Cam Robinson trade, the Josh Uche trade, the even DeAndre Hopkins or Cam Akers or Amari Cooper, looking at all of these trades, most of the differences are within $500,000 in surplus value to somewhere around $2 or $3 million, which is very, very low in the draft. So it's shown to be a fairly efficient market, even if, so that tells me one of two things. Either teams have an internal chart that they've already created, similar to what we've done, or they really have the vibes down on these things really well to create this kind of efficient market without necessarily having hard data around it. So it was a fascinating project, one that we're really, really proud of, really excited about. And it was really cool to kind of see, for the most part, a lot of these trades are very evenly valued, even if there isn't that publicly available kind of currency exchange to understand it.
Right. No, that's really an amazing finding. And I guess, like, before I, let you go, I did just want to know, like, is there anything sort of like, as you sort of go forward from here, like, is the plan? Obviously, I think you mentioned the article to sort of keep updating it as we have more free agency and more data. And you've also mentioned a couple of methodological sort of things, I guess, throughout the pod. But is there anything you sort of wanted to highlight of, I wanted to do that, but maybe didn't get a chance to on the first go around and just wanted to sort of get my feel for it first? Like, I don't know, what you're sort of thinking.
Yeah, and this is where I want to encourage like your viewers, like, pick up where we left off, right? Like this article or this entire write-up we put for free on our Substack. We want people to view it. We want people to challenge it. We want people to try and replicate the process because we want it to grow. Like, it starts a conversation or it continues a conversation that's already started, but it certainly isn't the final word. A few different things that I'm personally excited about that I hope to be able to continue to grow this is we've got to figure out how to properly value the fifth year option, right? Like, there is value to that. We didn't capture it in this. It would adjust things. The other thing that I find to be the most interesting part of the conversation is all of this is valuing these picks relative to the top 5 players at each position from a contractual standpoint, right? Which I understand the method for doing that, and I agree with it to a certain extent, which is why we tried to replicate it, because obviously the goal of every team is to get a top 5 player at a position, whatever position you're selecting. However, when we talk about the avenues that teams have to get better, the two major ones are free agency and draft, right? The trade market is a much, much smaller pool with which teams use. But the two major avenues that they use is the draft and free agency. The thought process is, if we were to compare this to free agents, it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, because in the draft, you have a much better opportunity to find a top 5 player at a position than you do in free agency. The reason being is most teams aren't going to let a top 5 player out the door. They're going to re-sign that player and keep them in-house because they're so hard to find, right? So in comparing the value of these draft picks, which have been essentially their value's been based on the top 5 players at each position, when we compare the value to what teams can find in free agency, you can't really find a top 5 player in free agency. So these aren't exactly fair comparisons when we're talking about how to use or allocate resources. So what I'm hoping to do in the coming years is to really start to analyze how good are the players available in free agency by position relative to, their positional group. So in any given year, is the 12th best quarterback by contract available? And if they are, trying to repeg these values to that rather than the top 5 players at each position. My hypothesis there is that it will inflate the value of draft picks, which would match how teams value them implicitly, right? And almost justify why they are doing that, working under the guise of our goal is to get the best player possible, and the draft is the best way to do that because of the access to those players. You don't get the same access to that type of player in free agency.
Right. And this sort of tracks with the podcast and the work that Ryan Brill has done that like sort of in the last month or two that we had the podcast with him on, where it was sort of capturing this idea that teams are shooting really not even necessarily like the top 5 heuristic sort of is just that, a heuristic. And his research said that like basically the sort of Jimmy Johnson curve, which it pretty closely tracks with historical outcomes, as you noted, more reflects the idea that maybe they're actually just shooting for these like the most tail outcomes. Like we're talking, top 15 player in the NFL type outcome, where other than that, that's sort of the curve that most like reflects their behavior. And it gets to the question of, oh, maybe they really are shooting for the moon on all these sorts of draft picks, or at least in the first round or two, which is a conclusion that I wasn't necessarily was surprised to hear, but maybe it sort of explains a lot of the behavior of why are they acting so suboptimally, even when Massey and Thaler and has been out for as long as it has, and the work of Brad and Jason has also been around. So it's definitely a really interesting conversation, and there's so much room for further research here, for sure.
Yep. And like I said, I invite others who find this fascinating to continue and to partner. Like I would love nothing. And that is one of the things that I just want to say about the community at large, how open they are to just continuing the conversation. Brad Spielberger has been more than generous with his time as I went through this project, saying, I'm trying to build off of what you've done. He was a great sounding board throughout the process and kind of looking over, and giving me advice on that. And Colin Dumfrey from Mofo Pod, he also, was very instrumental in what we were able to do and giving us feedback and things like that. And that's what I think is so cool about this space, is there is so much willingness to collaborate and to build off of each other. Because for the most part, we're all just looking to find the most efficient market and to understand things as best as we can. And so I want to encourage others, look through the work that we've done, find your own spin on it. And I'll be more than happy to share my insights and what got me here, or what got us here to help you build upon that and create something even better.
I really can't think of a more beautiful sentiment on which to end the podcast. So I think this is a great moment for us to wrap up. I just want to thank you, Josh, so much for coming on, for explaining all of this, for having for offering all your insight and having these fun conversations. I want to thank the audience also for hanging out and listening and enjoying this, being as crazy and interested about this type of stuff as we are. So all appreciated there. Yeah. Thank you so much, man.
Nah, thank you. It's been a blast getting to talk about this, Jake. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great. All right, bye everyone. Thanks, and we'll see y'all next week.